Hi, so I wanted to show how a well-tuned Kalashnikov trigger works. Well, actually, any Kalashnikov trigger. This is specifically a semi-auto action since I'm a civilian in the USA and I don't have the good fortune of owning a pre-ban AK. Actually, it's a very similar mechanism to an AR. A stock Kalashnikov trigger is very crude and rough, but it's actually one of the easiest triggers to make very nice and smooth. Easier than tuning an AR trigger, although the principles are fundamentally the same. So, the way a trigger works, as you can see, this hammer wing, which would strike the tail of the bolt here. I'll try to get that so it's not in shadow. Okay, there we go. Basically, the hammer hits that, which is the firing pin, which sticks out of the bolt, and pushes it out of, let's rotate it around so the light is right, the front of the bolt. I think you can just see that firing pin sticking about to flush the way I'm poking with my finger. With inertia and the hammer, it will actually poke out of there, probably a little less than a millimeter. Anyway, that you probably understand. And frankly, a lot of you probably understand this mechanism well. But apparently some people who are not, or who sell guns as professionally converted don't, because a friend of mine saw my nicely running Saiga and was impressed with it, and said he had one too that he had bought from a store as professionally converted, and that it would occasionally fire unintentionally. And so I listened to his scenario and description of it, and I was like, well, there's a possibility that it's him, or there's a possibility there's a burr or debris on the engagement surfaces of the trigger, or a failed spring in the disconnector, or it could actually be a badly done trigger job. That was actually, to me, kind of the least likely of those scenarios. I figured it was some break-in related. There's often paint hung up on the underside of the disconnector, or a burr or something that will prevent full engagement that will wear off with use, or a little bit of gunsmithing. Anyway, I looked it over, and sure enough, it had been polished and modified to have a lighter, shorter trigger pull. Unfortunately, they did it in a very amateurish, hackish way. I mean, the polish was smooth, but they changed the engagement angles and the amount of engagement, and they did it badly. So this is how it's supposed to work. This is a very smooth trigger. I believe I have something like 30 seconds of pull with this one. I'd have to remeasure it again, but it's pretty short. My other one is a little bit tighter because I'm using a Power Customs. This is a modified Tapco G2 double hook with the modifications necessary to work in a Saiga shotgun. But the principle and the job will work for any single hook designed AK platform rifle. It will take a standard AK trigger group, minus the clearance hump for the central bolster, or whatever you want to call that support strut. The ejector block, I guess, is the correct term. Anyway, so you can see these two hooks, which are wiggling right now, are connected to the trigger, and as they pull forward, they release the hammer. So the wings of the hammer are hooked on the hooks. With a single hook trigger, it hooks on one side. Single hooks are equally good. So I'm holding the trigger back as it would happen. The bolt carrier would come back, hit this, push it past the disconnector as it goes back, and then forward. All of that would happen faster than your finger moves. Now, as you release the trigger, it's currently hanging on the disconnector. As you release the trigger, it will pop up to the hooks. Now, you can see I've got more than a 1/16 inch of engagement on the hooks, and on the disconnector I've got roughly a 1/16. I'm not going to give you exact dimensions because those need to be figured out for your individual gun to determine the tolerances of safety. This is a common sense thing. Give it, the minimum it needs plus a bit, in precise engineering language. I would definitely say if you're down to a 30-second of engagement, you're in dangerous territory, and as that gun wears, it will become more dangerous even if it works temporarily, and you're also in a zone likely to have unintentional bump fire. So don't ever get that fine, and you don't need to have a very smooth, short, crisp trigger. That's one of the broad points. So if you watch this, you'll notice that my hammer has been profiled. Without taking this out of the gun, I can't show you exactly, but typically a G2 hammer will not hit exactly square to the tail of the bolt. It will hit at a slight angle. So, removing very little metal, I corrected that angle so that it hits it dead on instead of at a slight downward angle. And I smoothed the metal on either side of the striking surface so that the bolt isn't scraping past a corner, creating drag, and it's not moving the hammer up and down more than it needs to. It pushes it just under the disconnector, plus a little bit for good measure, and is not doing extra work. That will make your action smoother, as will polishing these rails with just sandpaper and oil for 15 minutes, and you will get you a smoother running gun than any amount of breaking it in with buckshot will ever do, or 10,000 cycles or whatever. You know, they've been unpainted for several thousand years, rounds of use, and they're all shiny. The metal in here is very close to stainless, and just a little bit amount of oil will keep it shiny if you could bring it to a high polish, and I wouldn't even call that a high polish. So you don't actually really need the paint on there for corrosion resistance. You can have it, it will run, but it creates more drag than is necessary. So this is me showing a trigger pull that's about, I would say, again, 3 seconds of total pull as measured from the tip of the trigger. It's crisp, smooth, and almost single stage. Alright, is single stage I should say. Double stage, the disconnector would hit the bottom of the wing as it comes forward and create a little bit of resistance right at the end, compressing the spring and the disconnector. So if you see here, the wing of the hammer just clears the top of the disconnector as it comes forward and releases. A little bit of a bump on the underside of the wing or on the top of the disconnector would make it contact. So if you have like an RSA adjustable trigger, or you buy, say, an Arsenal 2-stage trigger, that's what makes the difference and gives it the second stage. Is it has a little bump, so just as it's about to release from the trigger hooks, you're also pushing the spring of the disconnector a little bit. And that gives you your second stage. Now, when my friend gets here, I will show the same footage of his gun and show what they did wrong was they shortened the hooks on the trigger and they steepened the angle. Like currently it's hanging onto that wing at about a horizontal angle, and they changed it to like this. And what that causes is, if the trigger is held halfway kind of in between, if you look with my trigger, the hammer has to push the hook out of the way and catch the disconnector. And if it's right in between here, then it will catch on the hook as it slips off the disconnector. So if your trigger does a slight wiggle to make it come off of the disconnector, or perhaps there's a little bit of spring rebound in the disconnector as it barely engages, it's still going to catch on the hooks. Well, because their hooks were sloped and very smooth, that actually creates a leverage to push the trigger forward and cause it to slip off of that. So if you're cycling it slowly by hand, it will generally hook on the trigger, but every once in a while, if you're kind of in between, when it slips off that disco and hits the trigger, it'll push the trigger forward and cause it to release. That is an unsafe trigger, and I cannot believe that a professional, and put big air quotes on that professional, could sell a conversion and do that kind of a trigger job. Especially, and there's just no reason to change the engagement angle on the trigger hook or hooks. You can get such a smooth, such a crisp trigger, keeping the standard, whatever you'd want to call that, paralleled trigger engagement angle, that there's absolutely no reason. I don't have a trigger scale, but I would say I have about a 3-pound pull weight on this one, and a little bit lighter on my other. No chance of unintentional bump fire. It's smooth, it's precise, it's reliable, and there's plenty of safety margin. Like, this is way nicer trigger than will come on factory AK or factory AR, and frankly a lot of expensive AR triggers that I've tried. Well, maybe I'm exaggerating to say a lot, but So this is the so-called professional conversion that my friend bought from a gun store. I have no idea who did this, but it has an original Russian spec forend with the rail. It's got Tromix shark brake, those are decent. This was a thing that was made, oh, it's an actual Ultimac rail. Okay, I thought it was the EOTech one. This is a Tromix brand honey stick charger handle, but they kind of welded it on at an odd angle for somebody who was planning to use an optic. Like if you wanted to reach over the top, tilting it forward was a goofy way to do it. And it also apparently had some kind of welded on back sight. I'm not sure what that was, maybe an HK type sight. That would be the normal thing to do. They did not TIG the holes here. They used a back block, which I'm not sure if it's welded on for the ace or not, but these are just some things like if you're buying a Saiga 12, kind of what sets apart a professional conversion is whether they riveted or welded on the trigger guard, whether they TIGged the holes on, whether they used an adapter block in the back or welded on a plate. Can't quite see without taking off the cover whether this is a screw-in adapter or welded on. I think it might be a welded in plug, possibly the one that TAC 47 sells. But the welding here doesn't impress me. I'm not trying to be harsh on his gun. But here's the real problem that I have a big problem with, and that is how the trigger group is done. Now, as I described before, you can see, I'll go zoom in on that. The trigger group has a fair amount of hook, but they've shortened the front or the rear edge of the hook so it has less engagement. This is a single hook trigger, and they did some profiling on the hammer face, but it's basically square on the front edge. The rails haven't been polished, which I wouldn't call negligence. It sort of depends on the price point of your conversion job. I also installed the pistol grip screw in quite a weird way now that I look at it. So they didn't use the standard AK hole, they enlarged the former trigger hole forward. So the pistol grip nut doesn't have a positive stop in the rearward direction. But if you watch, I'm going to hold the trigger, release it, and I'm going to hold it slightly forward and push this slow. And it catches on the disconnector, and if it slips off slightly, it'll do that. It just did it. It pushed the trigger forward while I had slight pressure on the trigger. And won't do it every time. If you hold the trigger firmly and then release it quickly, it will catch. But it's possible to make it skip. There, I actually pulled it too much. There, it hooked properly. So it's not constant failure, but it's possible to do it unintentionally regularly. They changed the angle on the front of the hook, and they shortened the amount of engagement by filing the front of the hook. As contrast, here is what an unmodified double hook looks like. The angles are the same, but they shortened this surface. Let's get that in shot. They shortened this surface on the left hook. I'm showing the right one because it's in there. And they steepened this angle like I'm showing with my fingernail. And that's causing it to push that forward if it catches it with kind of impact as it slips off the disconnector and the trigger is partially pulled. It should completely exactly match that angle. Because they did that, they rendered this trigger unsafe. So what we're going to do, get a pointer, is use this double hook trigger in a single hook gun. Now as it pivots forward, this corner right here will hit the floor of the receiver and prevent the trigger from being able to do full stroke. So what some people will do is cut off the hook. But no, we're going to call that an advantage, not a bug. And instead we're going to cut a step in this trigger so it just barely runs into the floor right when your trigger has released, and therefore eliminating over travel. You now have an over travel stop that cannot wear out or rattle loose ever. And so you get a nicer trigger with a smoother, shorter throw. And on the other side back here, we can normally use the trigger guard screw or rivet to hold a washer down that will prevent it from, or that will sit underneath where the knife point is here, and that will eliminate your pre-travel. Now, if you go and eliminate too much pre-travel, you won't have sufficient engagement and you will have an unsafe trigger. You need to have at least a 1/16 of an inch of engagement on the hooks. the exact amount for your gun will vary. So, next thing is that I'm going to pull the trigger group out of here. You don't need to see that. Look at, say, Carolina Shooter Supplies videos if you want to see how to do that. But what I want to show here is how you modify the trigger group. So this point here will run into the bottom of the receiver. If you look into the receiver, you will see there's a slot on this side for the hook to go through. So right there. It's kind of hard to indicate. And on the other side, there isn't. So this hook is going to hit, let's rotate it. This hook right there is going to hit the floor of the receiver. And the way to solve that is to cut a little step there. Now you can see I've scribed a couple lines there. The way you do that is you hold square against the front of this like so, and scribe a line. It's much easier to do if you chuck this up in a vise so it isn't all wiggling around like it is in front of the camera, but you get the idea. Very small increments in change here make big differences in the amount of trigger travel. So if you think of this thing pivoting, when it hits the floor of the receiver it stops. That's your over travel limiter right there, when that bumps the floor of the receiver. This side limits pre-travel. Having a washer under here, which I like to cut a square washer out of sheet metal and use the pistol grip nut or the trigger guard screw to pin that down to the floor of the receiver so it can't move around. That will limit your pre-travel. If your over travel will allow it to fire and you have a little bit of extra clearance, it will be safe. Pre-travel is more touchy for safety. So leave yourself plenty of extra fudge room on the pre-travel. So what I'm going to do now is take it outside and grind a little bit of this away and then file it. And it's going to be like 2 swipes of the file and then a check for function. Like I said, say removing a 64th of material here will add maybe a 30-second of movement in the total trigger pull. So we're going to go slow. Okay, so I actually had footage of stoning the trigger that I was showing earlier in the group, but unfortunately I managed to hold the parts that I was stoning as I showed you how to do it just out of shot. So I'm essentially recreating that footage without the correct double hook trigger, so please bear it with me a little bit. So this is actually the defective trigger group that I pulled out of that gun. You'll notice there's a little filing mark here, which is proof where he changed this angle. Again, he made this angle steeper, like so, versus something like that. The original angle was approximately where the graphite is now. And it is now like that, if that makes sense. So that's why this trigger is unsafe, and just the tiniest bit was clipped off of this corner right here. That was all it took to render this trigger unsafe. Do not change this angle. It's unnecessary. By all means, polish and refine this surface, but keep the angle the same, and don't round the corner any more than it is already. Almost a sharp edge, but just short of being actually sharp is what you want. So if it comes sharp when you're stoning it, you probably removed too much material. A little bit more talk on stoning it. So, here is a hammer. This one is from a single hook mechanism. Actually, this is the one I took out. You'll notice down the middle of this whole part is a casting line. And the disconnector, which we see here, grabs right on that casting line. Oh look, the only spot on the trigger that's rough is the only spot that matters. And the same thing is true of the underside of the disconnector. This is really hard to light in such a way that I can get that to be visible, but if you look at it, hopefully I can get that to catch. There we go, you can just barely see the line, but there's a shiny spot right in the middle. I'll try to slowly pan this. There, you caught just a little bit of the shiny. And that tells you that all of the force on this disconnector is grabbing in one spot, and all the force on the hammer wing is grabbing on one spot. And that makes it gritty. Normally, you can get something like a good quality diamond sharpener, such as this Easy Lap brand medium coarse one, and then progressively finer, and keep the angles exactly the same. And simply you have to take the disconnector out to get a good hook on that, because you can see that this is changing the angle slightly. But if you take the disconnector out, you can slide this back and forth and get that true. Normally that will take about 15 minutes. The one I was working on yesterday was actually the worst I'd ever seen, and I ended up having to I spent a long time, and I ended up taking a file and very carefully moving the part along the file, just about 2 4-inch passes, and that cleaned it up. I wouldn't recommend files to you. I would say stick with stones or a diamond file, which is much less aggressive than a stone. And then as you get finer, either take very fine automotive sandpaper like 400 to 800 grit and wrap it around a ruler or a file and slowly move it back and forth, and you'll very quickly come with a very fine polish. Or if you happen to have it, ceramic knife sharpeners are very good. They're very consistent. You see some gunsmiths spend a lot of money on like Arkansas natural stones that are very, very fine, and they make a big deal out of it. It's mostly mysticism. Honestly, synthetic materials like ceramics are more square, they're more precise, they're more consistent at their eating rate. Or their cutting rate, I should say. So if you want a good fine polish, you don't have to spend a bunch on tools. You can literally go down to Walmart and spend $3 on a 3M multi-pack of automotive sandpaper and multi-grit and wrap it around a ruler or an old credit card and do every bit as good as those fancy stones. Helps to water it. And so the surfaces that you need to polish are the underside of the disconnector, the engagement surface, and when you have a double hook, you'll typically find that the planes are off in this plane. Try to keep my hand out of the light. Between the 2 hooks, and also that there's unevenness in this plane. So polishing it without really removing any metal, just uniforming it, is what your goal is. This one fell apart here. Anyway, so also where the this surface here where the hook hooks, and on the other side there will be a bigger wing on the double hook trigger, but basically anywhere metal rubs on metal, polish it, make it shiny. Don't change the angles. What you are going to change is unnecessary movement before and after the engagement. And that's what this drawing is about. I will zoom in on it in a second, but I'm going to show you a factory trigger from one Russian import. Oh, and incidentally, those casting lines are common to pretty much every AK trigger out there, except for some high quality ones like Jarred, which I wouldn't buy because they break, and the RSA Red Star Arms, which is an excellent adjustable trigger. But even that is improved with a little bit of a polish. So here is a factory trigger group from a Saiga. It's just the same, except for, oh shoot, well, that thing fell apart and I can't push it back together, but this little bit here is an over travel stop. As the trigger rotates forward, it limits its travel. Various AK trigger groups use different mechanisms. Some AK types have a rivet that limits pre-travel and another rivet that limits over-travel that the trigger body will bump into, or some feature added onto it. Having those rivets that are too tall or too short or in the wrong place can cause awful trigger slap, as can also the carrier hitting this portion here if it's a trigger group that isn't really intended for that spec of AK. And that will be quite painful if you're getting that one. So anyway, how do we limit over-travel and pre-travel? You have to start with a double hook trigger in a single hook gun. And the reason is, if you look at, and this is a top view of what you would see the hole cut out through an AK that the trigger body goes in. This dotted line here, which shows up faintly, it would be roughly the pivot point. The body of the trigger is here, the hooks are up here, The disconnector would be about here. And there's a little cutout in the floor of the receiver for the hook to pass through. Right there. But there isn't a cutout on the other side. So if you put a double hook trigger, it will hit the floor and it will not pivot. And you can't make it work. So you can cut the hook out of the way. But actually what you have there is a huge advantage. You have some material built in as an over travel stop that you can adjust. So the first thing you're going to do is basically you'll have to shave off a little bit of material right here so that that will clear the floor. So here is a drawing of the G2 double hook before you've modified it, the pencil lines. And what we're going to end up with is approximately the red line. So we've clipped off a little bit off the front of the body to make sure it clears the floor. Do make sure that happens, otherwise all your adjustments here will be wrong. If this is hitting the floor, you need to just trim it back just a shade more. And we're talking about hitting in this area right here. So you don't have to take much, maybe a 64th, maybe a 32nd, it kind of varies, but just you'll see just a shiny silver line here, and there's kind of a notchy spot there and a notchy spot there, and you basically go till the notch is gone on both sides. Let's make sure I had that in shot. So there will be a notch roughly here, and a notch roughly here, and you just shave vertically until that notch goes away. And I'll get into the tooling that I think works best for this in a second here. I would thoroughly suggest you stick this in a vise. So about the first thing you want to do is grab a square. And you're going to hold the square against the trigger hook. I have this on the wrong side of the trigger hook since we are dealing with single hook. And you'll scribe lines like so. Much easier to do with the trigger body in a vise so it's held steady. And now you can see I have several parallel lines that are reference marks. And we're also going to draw another line this way to make sure that we leave enough meat on the hook, so to speak. Because it's only really the corner that we care about. We're just keeping them parallel as a way of keeping track of progress. So you're putting a safety line here and measurement lines going horizontally. Now, what you're going to do then is cut out this material here up to the first line, stick it in the gun, and push the trigger pins in and the hammer pin, and make sure that they're fully seated. You have to have them fully seated, otherwise your test fitting will be inaccurate and will cause you problems. Maybe you'll remove too much material, maybe you'll put the gun back together and the trigger won't release. Neither one is good. Make sure the trigger pins are held all the way in, and you basically function test it without any springs with just your fingers while holding the trigger pins, or the axis pins, in with your left hand. So, looking at the drawing here, I'll zoom in on that just a little bit more. So, if we look here, you'll see you will end up removing approximately a 1/16 of an inch. Again, the settings will be determined by what allows the hammer to swing by, just by here, and leave you a little bit of extra trigger movement after it releases for reliability. Limiting your over travel can in no way lead to a dangerous condition unless you limit it so much that the hammer wing, which I'll actually just demonstrate with a hammer wing since I've got one, it has to be able to get past this. So if the trigger won't swing far enough forward for the hammer wing to swing past, then you've got a problem. So you want it to be able to go forward just enough that that wing can swing by. And a little bit just for tolerance, basically. So a good rule of thumb is about a 30-second of over travel is nice to do good follow through on your shot without slowing you down much. personal taste. Some people like more, some people like less, so adjust it to what you like. And so notice I gave myself extra guidelines before I even started cutting so I can measure my progress and go and just test and fit until it works. Now for the pre-travel or take-up, you put a spacer under here. A large fender washer will do. You're typically looking at around a 1/16 of an inch, but the critical thing is you have to leave yourself plenty of engagement here. You want at least about a 1/16 of an inch of engagement. More is probably better. Definitely don't get down to a 32nd. A lot of the time they express these sort of things in thousandths, but the point is, as things wear, you want them to have extra safety margin for safety, and you can get down to a ridiculously short pull and still have more than a 1/16 of solid engagement. So that is your most critical thing. A good way of checking what's going to be the right thickness of metal to go under here is to take a bent screwdriver tip and assemble your action with the spring on the hammer and basically bring it to the break point and then bring the trigger back to where the hammer is about here. The hammer wing is somewhere in the middle of that, and slide a screwdriver underneath here and mark on the thickness of the screwdriver where it is, and then cut your metal in about that thickness and file it thinner if you need to. And then you use, going back to the top view, so your spacer will sit roughly here. Remember, this is the hole that our trigger group goes through. And your spacer can use the rivet or screw that would hold down the trigger guard, or you can make it longer and use the pistol grip nut, which would be about where my finger is right now to hold it. I just cut a square piece of sheet metal approximately a 1/16 of an inch thick, or maybe 3/4 of a millimeter, somewhere in there. Again, this is the most critical one that you can overdo and render your gun dangerous. If you don't do this at all, your gun will be safe and will still have limited over travel. So my point is, I don't like a part that can come loose, so I prefer it to be pinned underneath a permanent part of the gun, preferably the trigger guard rivet. And I like to make a square washer rather than a round washer, just because then it can't wiggle around side to side, even if I had a loose rivet or something dumb like that. Not that I would leave a loose rivet, but you get the notion. And one last thing that I'm going to say before I end this clip of the video and get back to showing the actual fitting of the other trigger. If you notice this brown area here, once you limit your pre-travel, your take-up, you will often have to fit the safety. I should have taken the safety out of a gun to use here as a prop, but I didn't. So the safety tab engages roughly like this, with this corner of the back of the trigger body. Basically, it sits right here, and it pivots out of the way, and it pivots on top. Now, as you rotate the trigger forward, this will sit higher, and the safety may not slip over the top. Now, what most people will do is go and shave off a little corner of the safety. I would advise you not to do that, because right now you have the opportunity to get something a little bit nicer in your gun. Rather than fit the safety to the trigger, I would suggest you fit the trigger group to the safety. If you remove a very, very slight step where I've shown the brown here, and I've grossly exaggerated that, I'm talking about usually removing, say, 1/1000th, but the point is to kind of leave a little bit of a notch at the front of the safety stroke. And the point of that is, what that notch will allow it to do is, as your safety rotates forward, it will bump to a stop there and cannot rotate too far upward into your desk cover unless you give it a very deliberate nudge to make it skip over this hump. And one thing you'll find with a lot of home converted guns is that their safety swings too far upward. It isn't dangerous, it just looks sloppy. So here's a way you can make your gun a little bit nicer, just that last kind of pro touch that gives it that extra attention and makes your gun a little bit nicer. I have just started the notch in this trigger spark. You can see right there. And I basically brought it up to where the corner initially was, and I had this line scribed to give me a measurement of progress. I'll probably need to take a 32nd to a 16th more, but this is just put it in and try and see if you can get the trigger to function, or if the hammer will interfere with it, and if not, add a little bit or remove a little bit more until it works. So it's just an iterative check and fit process. So, as you can see, I removed about a third of the material between the lines. I expect I will need to get almost to the top line before it works, but we'll see here. I just keep it square and keep it parallel so I know my changes, and I keep my grind parallel to that line, and that's how I know how much change I do here is going to affect how much change I do there. If I change the angle, then I won't get the same result. Okay, so I've switched guns to show one that has actually I already finished, because the footage from the other gun wasn't very easy to see, but I wanted to show you here how we're checking to see the correct amount of pre-travel. And actually I'm going to pan through the gun here. So here we're looking at the pistol grip nut, and just in front of it is a square black washer that matches the color of the gun, and you can see this screw right here, right in front of my pinky there. That is what holds together the trigger guard. I may replace that with a rivet sooner or later, but actually it's holding in just fine. But anyway, that is holding down the pre-travel washer, which is underneath the rear legs of the trigger. I'm going to get that safety out of the way. So this square right here that I'm touching with my finger, that is the pre-travel washer. See, this leg sits on it. You'll also see a little bit of a shiny spot here. That is the safety stop notch right where my fingernail is, that keeps it from swinging up too far, as we discussed earlier. Okay, so here's how you do the fit. Now, assuming that I hadn't fit this all the way, you don't need to have the springs in here, but you do need to hold the pins solidly in with your fingertips while you do this. But I'm going to hold the trigger slightly forward, slightly back, to simulate it hitting the floor. So as I swing this, the hammer will hit the trigger hook and not be able to swing past. So that's how I know I need to take more off the front of the trigger to give it more pre-travel. After I go take this out, remove a little more material from this area here, if we had a double hook trigger, then it would be the effect of pulling the trigger a little further, which would allow the hook to slip past, and I'd look at that and go, oh, it's just catching the tip of it, it just needs a little bit more. So I give it a little bit more and check it again, and oh, it just slides the tip. And you can see that that catches firmly on that. It either has to be hooked on the disconnector or it has to be hooked on the hooks. That's how you know it's safe. And then when it's correct, as it is now, I can pull it, and you can see there's not a ton of clearance between the trigger and the hooks. There's just enough for it to function. I'm going to scooch the camera over so you can see that.